Hello, helicopter. Just in time for my video. Perfect. Oh, it's a cool one. It's got two helicopter thingies. Hello, internet. So, this week was a very interesting one because I dove into a topic that I know a little bit about, but I didn't really know much about. And the question that came to mind this week is, what is normal? When thinking about normal in the context of humanity and society, normal changes over time. And there's some crazy things I found in the past that I wanted to bring up here that I thought were quite relevant to kind of get this point across, is that I don't think it was like in the early 1900s. It was radiation water was a health trend, a health fad. People would drink water mixed with radiation because it was the healthy thing to do. Another one is a pharmaceutical company, I think Bayer or one of those, gave out heroin for cough syrup, for coughing and stuff. And the one that a lot of people like to talk about is that back in I think it's the geocentric model, or I think it's something like that, where we were at the center of the universe and everything revolved around us. All of these ideas and concepts and practices were all normal in those times. So people saw that as normal. Now let's take this concept of normality and apply it specifically to this week, which is on food. So how do you define normal in the context of food? What happens when we innovate in an area that's so close to the cultural norm? So when we speak about food and making innovations in food and big jumps in technology, this technology is impacting a part of our lives that is so close to us, because we humans, our cultures, our societies, a lot of these revolve around food. A lot of meaning, a lot of purpose, a lot of relationships and connections are made through the process of sourcing, cooking, and consuming food. So when you make a change in that, you have to think about what is the ramification of that, and can you actually change the minds of an entire culture around this thing that you think is normal. And that's just what we're going to talk about this week, which is clean meat. And this concept of clean meat is basically where you where you grow meat inside of a laboratory. And I'm going to go through the process and things like that, but I highly recommend you go check out the post that I've written this week all around this topic of normality and of clean meat. I've detailed out kind of how the process works, what it is, where it came from, why it's important, some of the problems with scaling it and kind of getting it out into the hands of the consumers, and all of these different things. So you should definitely go check that out. So clean meat, why is it clean? Why do they call it clean meat, and what makes the meat that we eat today dirty? Well, if you do a little Google, I'm sure you'll find all kinds of stuff, because there's a long list of reasons why the meat that we consume today isn't necessarily the cleanest way that we can get meat. And what I'll do right now is I'll list out a few that I think are some of the more kind of jaw-dropping ones that really catch your eye. And I'll also put up a graphic somewhere around here in my face to show some different things. So first we'll talk about land usage. Of the land on the planet that we can live on, us humans, that's not the ocean, that's not a forest, that's not something else, the land that's inhabitable that we can live on, that land, 50% of that is used by agriculture. And of that 50%, actually 77% of that is used by livestock. So a big chunk of that habitable land that we give to agriculture is used by livestock. And if you think about how the population is going to expand and grow, and if we are actually going to hit 10 billion people by 2050, which is what the gurus of statistics, mathematics, and the consensus say, we obviously don't have that much land to spare with the amount of people that we potentially might have on this planet. So I think maybe reducing that down is a good idea. Another thing is water usage. I came across an interesting factoid, hopefully it's a factoid, not a lietoid, that 1 pound of beef takes around 2,400 gallons of water, and that equals out to 6 months of showers. And that's just 1 pound of beef. So that's land usage in water. Another thing is around carbon emissions. So when looking at the amount of carbon emissions that come from the different sectors and industries, it's highly debated around where it comes from and who it comes from. But what I could find, and I checked a few different areas, it's between 15 and 18% of it comes from livestock, of the greenhouse gas emissions that we're emitting into the atmosphere. And in that 15 or 18%, a good portion of that is actually cattle and cows. And a big portion of the cows is actually their burps. So cows like to burp a lot. When I say a lot, they like to burp a lot. And these burps don't only smell bad, but they're also super deadly for the atmosphere because they're burping methane. And methane is actually, apparently, a fun fact again, 34 times more deadly for the atmosphere than CO2. Deadly in the sense that it actually captures more carbon within the atmosphere and makes a bigger impact. So it's not a good thing that they're burping so much and that they're spreading that methane all over the place. And then the last thing is the obvious one that most people know, is that it's just not nice to do this to animals. Because you think about it, of the factory farming and stuff like that, which I won't go into here, but you and I are lucky. We were given a lucky draw from the hand that was dealt to us. We were humans. We could have easily been something else. And I think it's just thinking about how unfortunate it is to be a cow or a chicken in these days is not the greatest. So that's just like one obvious thing that isn't the greatest around our meat. And by using clean meat over the traditional methods of sourcing our meat, which is basically funneling food, plants, and all that stuff through an animal, and then taking the animal and then turning them into our dinner, that's really, really inefficient. And inefficient in many ways. And clean meat could actually reduce the amount of land that we use. It could reduce the amount of water that we waste. It could reduce the amount of carbon emissions that are being emitted. But also it could improve the amount of time it takes for us to do this, because I don't specifically remember the specific dates, but I think it takes months I think it's like a chicken or something, months for a chicken to grow and then for it to be eatable. And then if you do it in a lab, it's like days. So the magnitudes are way lower. Lastly but another one is space colonization. So if we want to go to Mars and we still have an urge to eat meat, or we still want to eat meat, then you can't bring a cow with you to Mars, or you can't bring a bunch of chickens with you to Mars. You have to grow it through a lab. And obviously the last one is, if you are doing it in this way of growing it through a lab, there's a lot less pain and suffering on behalf of the animals that are going through this situation. And I'm sure if you Google it around why this is important, why clean meat is important, and why the traditional methods of us getting our meat is not the greatest, there will be a lot more passionate people about me on the internet, and they'll tell you all the different factoids in a more specific and probably emotional way. But with that said, we're going to get to what it is and how it works. So, clean meat, what is it? And where did it come from? So the history of it. This idea around growing your meat in a laboratory has been around for a while, and there's actually a Winston Churchill quote that a lot of people like to reference in the space from 1931, and I'll put it here. And it's interesting to think that back in the day, there were people thinking about this even then. So since then, there's been a lot of progress. A lot of things have happened in the space of growing cells and meat and all that stuff. And the actual first hamburger that was grown in a lab and actually consumed publicly was in 2013 with a guy named Mark Post. And interestingly enough, the person that funded this entire process was actually the co-founder of Google, Sergey Brin. And what I'll do is I'll put a video here of some of the food critics they fed it to, eating the hamburger.
Reduce the cost of meat production and could even be the answer to growing demand for beef. Critics, however, say that eating less meat would be a much easier way to tackle predicted food shortages. Well, here's a little bit of reaction. This is the food critic.
And this hamburger took roughly, I think, $325,000 to make in 2 years. And obviously that's unrealistic and that will never work for anyone, but the purpose of this project was to make sure that it was doable, that we could actually grow something that was edible, that tastes the same, and that looked similar. And after going through this process, over the last, I'd say, I don't know how many ever years, probably 7 or 8 years, there has been kind of a boom in companies that have been jumping into this space of clean meat. And there's people that are growing different types of fish. There's people that are growing different types of duck and chicken and beef and all these different variations of meat. They're figuring out ways to grow it through a lab. And there are some companies that are basically stating that they've gotten their costs down to $100 to $300 per pound of meat. And that's still ridiculously high for anybody like a reasonable income to purchase it on a daily or weekly basis. But it just goes to show how much it's dropped and how much it will continue to drop because of some of the research I've done around the different ways that they're figuring out how to scale the technology for the costs to come down. I've told you about what it is, told you about the history. Now let's talk about how this is done. How do we take a piece of a cow or cell and grow it into meat? So there are a few different phases and a few different steps. So the two big phases within this, there's one called proliferation. That's what it's called. Proliferation. It's a hard word to say. And differentiation. So making a difference in between the cells. So the first one is basically growing the cells. So you have to initially pick the cells, and once you pick the cells, then you grow them. And then the other piece here is basically growing the cells into different types of cells to make up the structure you're trying to make. So think grow and then kind of differentiate. Then there are 4 different technical steps throughout the 2 phases. So the different types of technical steps are the cell line development, the cell culture media, the scaffolding, and the bioreactors. So I'll explain all 4 of those. The first one is cell line development. And what's happening here is basically the scientists or whomever are basically, they say mining or harvesting the cells. And this comes in different ways, and this is probably not the greatest part of the entire process, which is basically they have to take the stem cells from an animal. And those stem cells can be taken from, right after a slaughter, they can take it from an animal that's alive and not hurt them. And they do this in ways where they basically add some sort of anesthesia around the animal. So when they take the muscle away, it doesn't necessarily hurt the animal. The animal can keep living until it's over. And then the other one is from, I think, an embryo. So these are the different ways you can get the stem cells. So once you get the stem cells, luckily they're coming up with ways where they can actually take these stem cells they've taken from the animal and they can continuously use those stem cells for a really long time. So they no longer have to keep coming back to the animal to get the stem cells. They can get kind of a small sample and then take that sample and just go like infinitely explode it. So that's a really cool piece there as well because they're harming animals less. Also within this phase, they're basically going to grow these cells as much as possible, and once they grow them, they're going to basically try to have these cells grow into different types of cells because there are different types of cells that make the meat the way that we want it. So there's fatty cells, there's different fibers in the cells, there's muscles in the cells, all different types of cells that make up the meat that we consume. So that's the first one, cell line development. The next one is cell culture media. So it's a really convoluted word, but basically it's think of like just a vat or a pot of magical juices, and we need to put these cells in these magical juices to help them grow and to help them grow in a specific way. And this vat of magical juice usually has different types and different levels of salt, sugar, amino acids, and growth factors. And growth factors are basically signaling ingredients that basically tell the cells to do a certain thing. So you have this vat of special juice. You throw the stem cells in there, and the next phase is actually the scaffolding piece. So in the scaffolding, you need to put in some sort of either biodegradable, something that dissolves over time, or something that's edible by people. So the cells actually grow around the scaffolding in the specific way that we want it to look, taste, and feel. So when you think of like a marbled steak, or a certain type of meat, it's usually grown in a specific way. So you see there's muscle, and then there's fat, and then there's different types of kind of structures in the meat. Well, think about this scaffolding as being like they put in like a template, and then the cells grow around the template, and then boom, you got yourself a steak. And the last part is bioreactors. So all of this stuff that we're talking about is happening inside of a bioreactor, and that's basically like the magical bathtub where this magical juice sits and where these stem cells and scaffolding kind of grow together. And the simple way I think about bioreactors is basically like throw some stem cells, throw in some juice, and pops out a steak. Basically, and it's just a massive thing that looks like, if you've ever been to a brewery where beer is brewed, it kind of looks like one of those. I'll put an image here. And that's basically it in a nutshell. I mean, obviously I've simplified it to a ridiculous degree, but in a nutshell, you grow the stem cells, you differentiate them, and then after they do that, they go through these different steps of basically getting the cells, growing them, putting them in the magical juice, and then putting them on the scaffolding, and then having them pop out of the bioreactor. And this is all good and fun, but how do we actually get this to consumers? And how do we scale this to a point where it's not $100 to $300 a pound? And there are a few issues, not a few, there's quite a few issues with getting to scale. And luckily, there's a lot of progress being made in the space. And I've listed out many of the issues in the blog post, but I'll just mention two here. One is basically the magical juices I've talked to you about. So the cell culture medium. They basically need to scale up the building blocks of that to be able to scale the juices that they're making. So think about the different levels of stuff that I mentioned around the amino acids and the growth factors and the sugar and salts and stuff. They need to basically be able to massively increase those building blocks so they can mass create these juices. And then the other one's not so technical, which is basically consumer acceptance. And this goes back to the point that I made in the beginning of the post, and I'll end with now, is that if you want to scale this, you need obviously consumers to want it to basically transition from their current eating habits to eating clean meats instead of the traditional meats consumed. And when you make a radical change in something that's so close to our hearts and has been so ingrained into our minds of what we think as normal food for millions of years as Homo sapiens, it's really hard because you really have to change how someone thinks about it. Unless you make something that's so good that they would prefer to have it. And that's kind of a note from Tesla's book, where Tesla basically created a car that was so great that everybody wanted to have it, and then they kind of pushed these great cars through helping the climate as well. So I think it's going to be a difficult one, but I guess the thing I want to end with is remember that our definition of normal is going to continue to change and will always change. It's fluid. And in the future, when people look back 100 years from now, they'll be thinking about obviously the thing that I mentioned around, the heroin cough medicine and the radiation water, but also they might be looking back at us and saying, why would they ever, grow an animal just to eat it? Because it's inefficient, it wastes a lot of water and land and emits a lot of carbon, but additionally, it's not very nice. But this week was clean meat, growing meat in a lab. And I hope you enjoyed it. This was kind of a divergent from the previous posts that I've written and videos I've made. It was super enjoyable though. I mean, I learned a ridiculous amount, and it's crazy how much I don't know. So, hope you enjoyed this. I hope that it was semi-entertaining, and I will see you next time.